Now let's look at the next question called Battenberg cake. This question has a lot of information provided to us first that we must read and digest in order to be able to tackle answering the question correctly. So it says here that the scene shown below is of a slice of Battenberg cake. All the colours are faint so you can see what you are trying to draw. The task is to write a program using only one type of block to draw the image shown. The hints are that the image is made entirely from square shapes, which we can see there are 5 square shapes, including the orange square in the back there, and then 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's highlight that carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's my 4 squares, and then of course the 5th one is outside here. And then it says, apart from one square that needs a radius of 32, all radius and position values are multiples of 5. And the next thing it says, you only need to use the 3 colors on the top row of the color picker, red, orange, and yellow. So of course the colors are specified here. As you can see, it says we need to only use one type of block, and we are only provided with one type of block. So we need to first, before coding the solution to this, fully understand every part of the block so we can make sure that we use the block to its absolute efficient method. So let's pull out the block here. Let's run the block as it is and see what happens. Now, as you can see, running this block creates a circle. This is because the number of sides is set to quite a high value. Now, because we know we are completely creating shapes made out of squares, we can go ahead and change the number of sides to 4 because of course we know that a square has 4 sides. Now, the color is self-explanatory. Of course, we'll be changing the color accordingly in relation to the squares that we are drawing. Now, because we've started off with a red square by default, let's attempt to draw that first top left square, which is also red. Now, of course, we can see that the square is almost in the right position, but not quite. And also, it looks a lot larger than what the square that is required is in relation to what we have. So now we know that in order to change the position and to change the size of our square, we of course need to use the 3 values that are on the bottom part of this block. So the first value we can see is radius. Now let's have a look. The radius 20 creates a square this shape. Let's have a look at the radius that's been given to us, which says 32. Run that and see what happens. Now we can clearly see that 32, which was larger than 20, has created a much larger square. Now let's understand what the radius actually is in relation to this square. Now, using our mathematical understanding, radius is a definition or a key term that we often associate with circles. So going back to the circle, you understand that the radius of a circle, I'm just going to create a circle for demonstration purposes here again. The radius of the circle is any point from the center of that circle to any of the edges. Now, the same concept applies to the square. So if we were to change this back to a square and draw it on our canvas, the radius is essentially the measurement between the midpoint section and any of the 4 edges of this square. So in this case, we could actually use the grid and ruler provided to us to roughly estimate and understand that this square has a radius of 32 because the measurements between the midpoint up to each of the edges is actually 32. So we could, again, for drawing purposes, we can use this. This measurement from here to here is 32. So is this. This is also 32. And this is 32. So if we wanted to draw the smaller square, because this square has obviously drawn us the correct size for that orange square, we could probably change this to the orange color and park that particular block on the side because we know that that's almost done. So if we wanted to draw the red square, we could duplicate this block and we could, of course, carry on using the features of the block to draw the red square. Now, before we do that, in order to make our code organized and understandable, we need to rename our blocks. So if I call this one yellow outer, and then I call this red 1, then of course this will allow me to identify each block and its corresponding shape that it's trying to draw. Now, This particular square is the background square. So for now, I'm actually going to disable it and I'm going to leave it there because it's almost finished. The only thing that needs to be changed is the position because it's not quite being drawn in the correct position on our canvas. So let's run this. We now have started back off again with our red square. Now, in this case, we know that the radius does need to get smaller purely because we know that the radius of this particular square is much smaller than the background square, which encapsulates all four squares put together. So because the radius and position values have been told change in multiples of 5, let's try 20 for our radius and see if that gives us a shape that looks very much close to the shape size that we need. Now, we can change this further to 15 because I do think it looks a little bit big, and we can leave it there for now because the only way to truly check if that square is exactly the correct size is to move it on top of the faint red square that has been provided to us as a guidance. So let's now look at the position X and Y values because these are really important. Now, currently as it stands, the position X and Y values is 20 and 20. So my square is being drawn around that center point. So in order to use the grid correctly and to use the position X and Y correctly without wildly guessing too many numbers and effectively wasting time in our challenge, we can use the grid to sort of move our square into the correct middle point location, which is here, using those X and Y numbers. So if my X or the middle point is roughly here, I can draw a line up and I can sort of draw a line here and say, but that's sort of like 30, 35. So if I change my 20 to 35, I can actually make a more accurate estimate to help me identify the exact location of where my red square should be. Now, as you can see, using that has allowed me to actually put it into the correct position in the first go. But even if you didn't do it in the first go and you put the number 30 or 40, that would have given you a much closer guesstimate in relation to the grid provided than going up in values of 5 or multiples of 5 with every possible combination. So it's important to understand that the radius, the X and the Y are values that are given to us to help us estimate where we should put our shapes quickly using maths rather than taking guesses. So now that we've successfully placed our first red square, it actually makes drawing the second red square really simple because all we need to do is duplicate the square, rename it, of course. So I'm going to rename it red 2. I'm also just going to use the hide menu function to allow me some more space. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what I need to change using my knowledge of the features or the points in this square in order to move this square down to here. Now this is clear to see that the radius needs to remain the same. So I now need to use my understanding of X and Y to roughly plot exactly where that starting point is for the drawing of my square, and then use those values to help me identify the numbers. So I'm actually going to use 65 as a starting point and see what that does. Now if I put 65 and 65 in and run it, as you can see, using that process of drawing my midpoint, using my X and Y coordinates using the grid provided, I have been able to accurately estimate exactly where my position needs to be. Now, using the process of elimination, this is actually becoming much easier because now I can go ahead and duplicate the red block in order to draw the yellow block. So let's just change the name to yellow 1 and then change the color to yellow, and now we know that the radius for all 4 blocks does absolutely need to be the same. So if I was to draw this, now you can see that the location X and Y just needs to change. So if I go ahead and use that method of the grid to identify, for example, this yellow block, I can see that it sort of hits sort of 30 and 65. So let's have a look. Let's try that out and then see what happens. So again, I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I said the numbers were 30 and 65. Let's run it and see where my yellow block goes. Now, interestingly, the 65 seems correct, but actually my other number, 30, is slightly too far on the left. So I'm going to go back, and actually I can see that the number 35 has been used for position X before. So let's mirror that. And of course, using the fact that we need to go up in multiples of 5, let's put that in. And as you can see, that successfully put my yellow block into the correct location. So again, I'm going to hide the menu. And now I'm just going to use the process of duplication again in order to duplicate this block in order to create yellow 2. Now it's really easy to see that the numbers that we've already used for X and Y are really helpful. This is because the radius remains the same, but position X and Y are essentially the same position for this red block and this red block. So we can actually use the numbers that we've already used, or carry on using the grid if that works well, to identify the midpoint and thus the X and Y value. So I can see this hits 65, which also is a value that's been used already. And this sort of hits over here 35. So let's now move on and change the values from 65 to 35 and run this. And brilliant, we've now got our 4 squares in the middle, and as previously created and just disabled, we did actually create our outer block. So I'm going to just put that here and enable it and see what happens. But as you can see, it is still in the wrong location. So all now we need to do is use our understanding of X and Y coordinates and positions to move that particular square into the right position. So again, I can use my understanding of the grid. So this looks like 50. This also looks like 50. So let's change position X and Y to 50 and 50 and see what that does. So let's go here, 50. Let's go here, 50, and then run it. And then as you can see, I've got the correct answer, and this is exactly what I was looking for. So well done. Did you get that answer correct? How did you do? Let's have a look at the answer and explanation provided to us on the website. Now, as you can see here, the explanation says that in the key tips tutorial, it's often helpful when solving these problems to right click on some of the blocks you know are correct and disable them. Now, we did this specifically with the orange block, which was the outer block, because we used the radius given to us to help us get started. This will let you see the pattern beneath while you program in other parts of your image. This is the equivalent of a technique called commenting out in text-based languages, but is somewhat more elegant. So we use this method to disable the block at the top here as seen in the possible answer, and then of course we put it back in right at the end when we needed to put it in after looking at the other 4 squares which we needed to solve first. Now, the key thing with these image questions is to make sure that the shapes you want to appear behind are drawn first. So in this case, your one possible answer was pretty much similar to the way that we created the answer, was to create the orange outer bit, then the yellow inner bit, then the 2 squares on either diagonal side of the red. Now, what we did is we created 2 squares here for the yellow and 2 squares here for the red and 1 final square here for the orange. But what you could have done as another possible solution was to draw a slightly larger radius yellow square, which was only slightly smaller than the orange square. Now, what we did was used 5 squares instead. But as you can clearly see on the website, it says here that this is one possible answer. So the way we solved the answer still gave us the correct answer. So it is still correct, but this is also another way of approaching the answer and getting a different solution. Which solution did you come up with?